So, Gary, thank you once again for coming back to the podcast. I'm so happy you're here. And I know a lot of people that have listened to you before or have read your book, How to Think Like a Pancreas, have so many questions. And one of the questions that we're often asked, and then I always say, go get Gary's book. I really do. I'll be like, here's the Amazon link for it to help answer a lot of these questions is it's about eating and food and life but beyond just basic carb counting, because, and I know like even now sometimes, we're absolutely certain that we've done it all right and we've counted it right and it should be perfect. And then it just all goes crazy. Why does that happen? Is it a cosmic thing or is there really like a science behind it?
It's a little cosmic and a little science. Even if we do account for every molecule of food we consume, there's so many variables. There's just a countless number. A friend of mine, a guy named Adam Brown, he's written some books also. He tried to make a list one time of all the factors that affect glucose levels. And I think after years of compiling lists and lists, he just kind of said, all right, that's enough. But yeah, there's so much stuff. And what we feed, what we put in our mouths, also, there's an almost endless list of variables involved. Because, you might think, it's just the carbohydrates we have to worry about, but that's obviously not the case. If somebody eats a carb-free meal, their blood sugar is still going to go up. The timing of the rise in blood sugar can vary based on what we eat also. So looking beyond carbs, looking at some of the other factors of our food and our diets is worthwhile. We're never going to get it absolutely perfect. We're not going to really be a pancreas. We're not going to be that good, but at least we can get pretty close to thinking like a pancreas.
You're not going to change the name of your book, are you?
No.
Get close to thinking like a pancreas.
Yeah, it loses its cachet when you throw all those extra.
Yeah. Google search is probably going to be harder.
Think almost like a pancreas.
Think almost like a pancreas.
One time we were thinking of changing it to think like a beta cell.
Oh.
Pancreas still sounds better.
No, pancreas, think like a pancreas is very mystical, very catchy, because we're all out here trying to do it and don't feel like we've always, while you say it's not going to be perfect, but we haven't quite perfected the art of thinking like a pancreas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is an art and a science. There's a little of both. I think that the more scientific we can become about it, and the more we understand, the closer we can approach really doing what a pancreas would. And that's okay, because we don't have to be perfect with diabetes management. Even people without diabetes like yourself still have variations in glucose. It still goes up and down, not as much as it does in someone with diabetes like me, but it still does vary. And what we've learned over the last few decades is that it's all right. The blood sugars can vary. You can be a little higher than non-diabetic ranges and still be able to avoid the long-term health problems and live a healthy, productive life, feel good, and perform well day in and day out. So we do have to be realistic about what's achievable and realize it's okay to not have normal glucose all the time. It's okay to run some highs and run some lows. It's not going to detract from our quality of life.
When you say, I think for qualification purposes, because that can work either way, when you tell people it's okay to be a little higher, or the research is saying that, what does the research say? Like how much of a little bit higher?
Well, I'll put it in terms most people can relate to, which is the A1C, which is, it's just an average glucose. A non-diabetic A1C is typically between about 4 and 5.9. So once you get up into the 6s, you're not in a normal range for your average glucose. But the research shows that once you get that A1C down to about 6.5, there's not much benefit to getting it tighter. The long-term health complications don't go down much, if at all, when you lower it past 6.5. So having an A1C somewhere in the mid 6s is good enough for most people. I mean, there's exceptions like during pregnancy or if you're preparing for surgery, things like that. But otherwise, having an A1C in the mid sixes is perfectly fine. There's no significant benefit to getting it to 5.5 or even to 6. We also have to balance it against the hypoglycemia risk that we're up against. And somebody who has an A1C of 6.7 with very little hypoglycemia, I would consider them to be in better control of their diabetes than someone with an A1C of 6 who's having hypoglycemia on a daily basis. So you got to look at the big picture.
Yeah, that's what I often tell moms that are freaking out when they see A1Cs. And I know some that they get really tight. Like, I don't know how they're doing it. Because they're using a Dexcom, they can see their child's numbers. My son doesn't use that system, so I can't see his. So I'm kind of living, blindly. So I don't have as tight a control. Now he's a teen who has control. But that makes a lot of us feel better because we are warned, by our doctors about the hypos and things like that. And then I was never really sure. The reason I asked that question, because I always think when I see people that are much older than my son, and then they talk about the diabetes technology that they used to use, or how they used to even have to, urinate, boil it, and do all this other chemistry experiment in your kitchen every time to get your blood sugar reading. And I see them as adults with little or no complications whatsoever. That gives me so much hope for the future, because I imagine they probably didn't have as good at A1Cs as we're seeing in kids and adults now that have access to the technology. So I'm glad there's some science to prove my theory.
Yeah, there's some luck. There is science to it, but there is also some luck involved. Long-term complications aren't determined exclusively by glucose levels. There's also lifestyle that plays a role. There's certain genetic aspects that play a role, hereditary aspects. And then there's, just the God factor, just this pot luck where some people seem to be at greater risk for developing these problems than others. But still, more than half of the risk is accountable by glucose control. The glucose control does not have to be perfect. It can be good enough if it's near normal most of the time.
Right. Time and range. Yeah. Okay. That's really good to know. So having said that, then how can we, when we're eating and enjoying life and all these different things, what should we think about when we're eating food? And then I was talking earlier about like that perfect bolus or that perfect dose, and it's not so perfect. What should we do to be okay most of the time? What should we be looking out for, or what can we learn from you today? I know that we could do a 24-hour like Gary Scheiner podcast marathon and still not know everything.
Maybe but do a fundraiser. We'll see.
Yeah, like the former, what was it, the telethon that they had in the U.S. with Jerry Lee Lewis? Not Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis would be the musician. That would be different. So
those are two very different people.
Those are two extremely different people. That's a different kind of telethon, different marathon.
A good starting point would be, what is your son's favorite food?
Oh, he's got many, but
pick one.
I would say there's a few things. He likes meat, red meat, which and that's a challenging one for him. So either like a good steak with some potatoes on the side, or we found this amazing Japanese ramen noodle place. Oh, it's so good, but there's carbs, there's meat on it, there's there's fat in it because the broth and the eggs and everything else. There's some vegetables in it, but
that's a good challenging one we can look at.
That's a big challenging one.
Ramen noodles that has a lot of steak on it, for example, maybe some vegetables. It's likely stir fried, so it's absorbed a lot of oil in the cooking process. So if you're able to count the carbs in a meal like that, you're a genius, because that is not an easy thing to count. I use fist measures as an estimate for determining how much of something I'm eating, and then you can sometimes convert that to grams of carb. But honestly, even if you get the carb count right, you still have to account for the effects the protein and the fat are going to have. You used the term before, the perfect dose or the perfect bolus. And to me, it's two things. It's the amount and the timing of the insulin. You can take the right amount. If it's not timed properly, it ain't going to work. You'll either go low and then rise later, or you'll spike up and then drop later. So the timing is pretty important. So let's first talk about the protein part. If he's having a steak or a meal with a lot of protein in it, like a steak would have, protein can raise the blood sugar level directly. And it does that particularly when you're having a low carb meal. So if he's having, let's say, just a steak, that steak is going to contribute to a rise in his blood sugar. And the reason is that his body needs glucose. That's the main energy our body burns. If there's no carbohydrate in the meal or very little carb in the meal, his body's going to convert some of that protein into glucose. That's one of the jobs of the liver, is to produce glucose when there's no carbs being digested. So some of the protein, upwards of half the protein, can turn into glucose over the next several hours. Again, that's reserved for situations where there's little to no carbohydrate being consumed. Most people who have a decent amount of carb in their diets and eat carbs throughout the day, the protein is going to have little to no effect. So we don't really have to be concerned about it. But for those who are having very little carb in their meals, people on ketogenic diets, people on just low carb, taking low carb approaches, then the protein needs to be accounted for. It can complicate things a little bit because then you have to start counting protein grams. And we often teach people to just count the protein grams and assume half of that's going to convert to glucose. Is it going to convert as fast as carbs would? Probably not. It's going to take a little longer. So the dose of insulin can be given a little later than usual, or it can be split into two parts. Or if somebody's using a pump, they can extend their bolus for a few hours to cover that. We see this with people who have eggs. If they just have some eggs, their sugar is going to go up over the next few hours, even though there was no carbohydrate with it. But if they had eggs and toast or eggs and waffles, the eggs don't have any impact on the blood sugar because the carbs are providing enough glucose that there's no need to convert the protein into glucose. So that's where we start seeing the effects of protein, is with low carb meals. If he has a steak and a potato, the potato is going to supply more than enough carbs that the steak shouldn't have much impact. If he's having ramen noodles with steak, the noodles are providing the carbohydrate. So it's not something to worry about. But if it's a mostly protein meal, then yeah, the protein needs to be accounted for.
And then I've read, I think you must have this in your book, maybe even the like per ounce, or there's a conversion for the amount of protein you eat to anticipate how much is turning to carbs.
Yeah, there's a way to estimate how much protein is in the food to begin with, but it varies based on what you're eating. Things like nuts are high in protein, legumes have a decent amount of protein. Dairy products have protein, plus all meats. Fruits and vegetables usually have a minimal amount of protein in them, as well as grain, starchy types of food. So it's mostly the legumes, the nuts, the meats, the dairy products. And I mean, there are charts. We have charts we can send people that list them out. But I believe the average egg has about, I think it's between 6 and 8 grams of protein, depending on the size of the egg. So if somebody's having a 3-egg omelet, like a cheese omelet, let's say, there might be 20 grams of protein there. If they're not having any carbs with it, we'd recommend dosing as if they were having 10 grams, half of the protein that we would cover.
So back to our meat and potato example, and things look beautiful. We bolused well. I go in and I'll check maybe at night when he's asleep. And even if I've done, because we're on an insulin pump, I might split the bolus or do a square bolus and try different things. But sometimes still 3 or 4 hours later, it's a disaster. It's like we didn't bolus anything at all. And then it's very hard to bring those down. I think especially if you're injecting, from what I understand from other parents' experience with the pump, you can do some temp basals or, slower release boluses and things like that. But why is it that, we think we get it right, and then like 4 hours later, we're wrong?
Well, it's because you got part of it right. You covered the carbs, you may have covered the protein properly. But often when you're having, especially restaurant meals, there tends to be a lot of fat in those meals as well. And fat has a completely different effect on blood sugar levels than we see from carbs or even from protein. When there's a large amount of fat in a meal, it does two things. First, it slows down digestion of the rest of the meal. So the carbs are going to hit more slowly and gradually. So that's where delaying your dose or extending delivery of the dose is necessary. As fat slows down gastric emptying, food sits in the stomach much longer and takes longer to get into the intestines where it absorbs if there was a great deal of fat in the meal. That comes down to caloric content. The stomach is sort of programmed to only allow a certain number of calories through at a time into the intestines. Fat is very high in calories. So when you mix that with carbs or protein, it's going to take much longer for those foods to get through into the intestines. Sometimes several hours, whereas it might have only taken a few minutes originally. So slowing down the digestion of the carbs is part of the problem. And that part is why you might see the blood sugar start climbing a few hours after the meal instead of right after. But then there's that other part, and you mentioned the frustrating aspect of trying to fix those highs and having it go nowhere. That's also caused by the fat, but it's a different kind of different approach, different reason that it's happening. Large amounts of dietary fat cause a rise in triglycerides in the bloodstream. And when triglycerides go up, the body, and the liver in particular, becomes insulin resistant. You might have heard the term insulin resistance around people with type 2 diabetes, because that's one of the main underlying causes of type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. So whatever insulin the body has made or whatever insulin someone has taken doesn't work as well when we are insulin resistant. 2 units might work like 1 or a half a unit, just because we're not sensitive to the insulin the way we normally are. So that insulin resistance caused by a high-fat meal can carry on for 6, 8, 10, 12 hours sometimes. I experience this when I go to the movies and get the popcorn.
Popcorn.
I love movie theater popcorn.
Oh, we do too. I think I'm going to send Aaron to you, and you can just go and give him a course in it. And
I float in on the aroma and get my big bucket. Sometimes I get the refill and bring it home.
Oh.
But there's a lot of fat in that stuff.
There is.
And if I bolus anything at the beginning of the movie when I'm starting to eat, I'll go low in the middle of the movie because it's so slow to digest.
Mm-hmm.
Not only does the popcorn have a lot of fat that slows down the digestion, it's also got a lot of fiber that slows it down too. So the bolus has to be extended. I can't give any of it up front. But the job's not done. By the end of the movie, even if things look great, my glucose is going to climb all night long because of the insulin resistance that all the fat is causing. And the way I fix that or counteract that is with an increase in my basal insulin during the night. On a pump, it's easy to do. You just program it in. On injections, it's a little trickier, because most people are using insulins that are pretty flat for 24 hours. You can't just raise your basal rate for the next 8 hours with a long-acting insulin. So sometimes we go back to an old school insulin called NPH. You remember NPH insulin?
I do not know if we have NPH.
Aaron he never used it, did he?
Mm-mm.
NPH is a cloudy insulin. It has molecules attached to the insulin that create almost like a time-released action. It works gradually over about a 10 to 12 hour period. So it has a bit of a peak between 4 and 8 hours. So taking a little bit of that near bedtime after a high-fat meal can help offset the effects that all the insulin resistance is causing. But pumps are a great tool. People have access to them. I encourage use of them because of tools like we can make temporary basal adjustments for dealing with those situations. So again, with a large amount of fat in a meal, you're slowing down digestion. So the carbs are going to convert to glucose more slowly. And you have insulin resistance that might go on for the next 6 to 10 hours. So you can expect a gradual glucose rise to take place. Now, if you're having that high-fat meal early in the day, potentially you could offset it with extra exercise later on, or you can offset it with small doses of rapid-acting insulin later. But most of the time, we're having those high-fat meals in the evening, and it makes it really challenging to manage glucose overnight. So that's, again, where pump therapy can be so useful.
Yeah,
the new systems, the automated systems that, the hybrid closed loops that adjust the basal automatically can help a little bit with those. Some of them are robust enough that they will increase the insulin sufficiently to keep things fairly close to normal overnight. But sometimes if there's enough fat in the meal, even the pump's own adjustments aren't enough. The glucose will still rise a bit.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know that. Those have only recently come into the market here. So there's a few people that have them, but it's still very, very new. So yeah, I thought I was actually going to ask you that question about how they would hold up against movie popcorn.
I can tell you from experience, not so well. I still have to do a lot of the decision making, making of adjustments. Some of the systems, some of these automated systems allow the user to make adjustments or tell it to be more aggressive or less aggressive for a while others don't. So it really depends on the system somebody's using. I love a system that gives me flexibility to customize things. Other people, they don't want to think about it. They just want it to do its thing, not be as engaged. So that's the trade-off.
Yeah. And something you mentioned earlier, and because we're talking about protein and fat and all of this, keto. Is it good for people with diabetes to have a keto diet that's full of meat and fat?
The one advantage, and it's a proven advantage of a very low carb diet, is the blood sugars do tend to be more stable. We see fewer peaks and valleys in the glucose when people are following low carb or ketogenic diets. That's the only advantage. There are a number of disadvantages, though. From a nutritional standpoint, it's not the best. Carbohydrates, a quick source of energy, and people who don't eat carbs tend to have lower energy levels than people who are having carbs on a regular basis. From a palatability standpoint, it's just not as pleasant either. Carbs are delicious, when people like them. There's certain joys of life we're depriving people of if you tell them, you can't eat carbs. And there's also the complicating factor of not knowing exactly when your blood sugar is going up. If you're only eating protein and fat, you're going to get some rise in your blood sugar. You don't know exactly when. With carbs, it's more predictable. So you still have to dose for those foods, even if you're not eating carbs, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But the timing is a little bit trickier. And there are some issues in children. I never recommend very low carb diets. It's essential not only for physical development, physical well-being, proper nutrient absorption. There's also psychological benefits of maintaining a near normal type of a diet like other people do. So I think there's a lot of value in having carbs in one's diet. Not unlimited. I don't think you don't want to go crazy with the carbs. I teach people who are really concerned about it that you can have carbs and have pretty stable glucose if you choose the right kinds of carbs. There's this term you probably heard, glycemic index. It's a way of kind of summarizing how quickly a food is going to raise the blood sugar. High glycemic index foods cause the blood sugar to spike pretty quickly. Those are challenging. They're not impossible to manage, but they're challenging. The insulin has to be given well in advance, and you're still going to get somewhat of a rise and then a drop. So high glycemic index foods include like cereals, breads, potatoes, especially white potatoes, rice, white rice, juices, most sweet candies. Those are the kind of foods that'll send the sugars up fast. But we also have a lot of carbs that are slower to digest. Those are the low glycemic index types of carbs. Popcorn is a good one. It's like I mentioned before, all the fiber in the popcorn really slows down the rate of digestion. Legumes are very slow to digest. So foods with beans in them, really good to have. Nuts, they have carbs, but they're slow to digest. Even pasta, particularly pasta that's slightly undercooked, still a little bit firm, very slow to digest. Whole grain pasta, very slow to digest. Whole fruits like apples, pears, slow to digest. Dairy products such as milk, even ice cream, they're relatively slow to digest. So you can have your carbs and still manage your glucose levels, if you pick and choose them wisely. Not that you can never have the high glycemic index stuff. I still do. I mean, I eat cereal every morning, but I've learned how to manage it. I've learned how to time my insulin properly. Earlier we were talking about like the perfect dose of insulin. Mm-hmm. It's the amount and it's the timing. You can time your insulin to match when your blood sugar is going to be going up. Now you're in business. You don't time it properly, you're going to have problems.
I'm impressed that you eat cereal. I feel like cereal is kind of evil. Not so much for people with diabetes. If you get the insulin timed right, then it's, great. But then when it's not timed right, it's a disaster.
It is.
And I always can't help but wonder, what is that doing to people without diabetes? Because I feel like it must make our pancreas have to work that much more to digest it.
Yeah,
so
it does.
I'm not a
put out a
huge
lot of
fan
insulin all at once.
Yeah, and it's
processed. You got a healthy pancreas, it can handle it. Interestingly, I've learned some cereals are better than others. If I eat something like cornflakes, my blood sugar will spike to kingdom come. It really goes up fast. If I have Cheerios, it's much more stable. But, that's for me. I've just learned that it works much better. So there's a lot of individual differences.
That's
one
true.
food I've still not figured out is bagels. I love bagels, but bagels just seem to send my blood sugar higher than science should dictate they should. I can, again, break that bagel down to its bare molecules. I know exactly what it contains and I dose for it. Doesn't matter. The diabetes gods are out to smite me when I have bagels because I go up pretty high.
And I'm sure you've tried many different types of bagels, different places, different.
I've just learned if I think it's got 60, I got a dose for 80 or 90. It's the only way.
Wow. How interesting. Yeah, we have one place comes to mind. You can get bagels in the supermarket. There's one place that sells bagels here. And it's been a while. I don't remember how bad it was. Aaron is the same with the Cheerios. That was the only cereal that did not spike him. Mm-hmm. But because cereals are quite highly processed and you just, don't know. So I don't make Cheerios, but I make granola at home, which he likes. And I just don't really buy the cereal anymore because, again, the processed food, I'm not anti-cereal, but just when I start looking at certain foods and ingredients and even the quote unquote healthy cereals were causing spikes, or they market themselves as healthy, which plain Cheerios doesn't have added sugar, but they market themselves as healthy, but then the second ingredients is like sugar or something. So I just kind of stopped it to expose him to other things. Like, he loves meat. I promote plant-based. He still eats plant-based. Like, we're having a complete full plant-based dinner, more vegetarian dinner tonight, not animal protein based. So
almost all vegetables are low on the glycemic index. There's a little bit of carb in every vegetable. It's not a lot, but it's also slow to digest. So veggies are a great thing to have. When we describe what someone's plate ought to look like when they're having healthy meals, instead of a big meat, a big starch, and a little bit of veggie, we try to make half the plate vegetables, and then modest portions of the starch and the meat. I'm curious, what do you put in your granola?
I have the recipe on my website. I'll put it in the show notes for people listening, but I put usually oats, whatever I have available, but pumpkin seeds, almonds, like sliced almonds, and pretty much anything grain and nut that I have that I kind of want to throw in, and just mix it with a little bit of coconut oil. And it can be monk fruit, or it could be like a little bit of maple syrup or something to give it some sweet taste to it. Or it might be like, there's some keto maple syrups. I've experimented with those, and lay it out on a baking tray and put it in. I don't add dried fruit until after. Aaron's not he is a big dried fruit fan, but not so much in his cereal. Like, he loves Turkish dried apricots. They're amazing. Like, the first time he discovered them, he just went nuts. And I was like, yeah, blood sugar is not gonna like that. But yeah, so we don't get spikes with that.
Well, the seeds, the nuts, I assume they're rolled oats.
Yes.
And the oil you're adding, it's all very, very slow digesting food, and it kind of latches on to any little bit you've added that might digest quickly and slows it down too. So you've got a great formula for a nutritious, healthy, slow digesting breakfast. And it's far from carb free. So that's, people who are
no, it's not
carbs,
yeah,
can have carbs and manage their glucose beautifully. And it's okay once in a while, indulge, have something that'll spike your blood sugar once in a while. It's okay. That's not going to cause any long-term damage if it's just now and then.
Yeah. And I feel like also kids that are growing up with diabetes, or even if adults, they've just been diagnosed, like, they shouldn't fear food. They have to try, just like trying anything, whether it's like, I'm thinking of Aaron has geometry this year. It's learning geometry for the first time. You're not going to get all the formulas and everything correct. You're going to fail. So that's how we learn. And then we fix it and correct it and do better next time.
Yeah, I often describe diabetes self-management as trial and adjustment. That's all it really is. You try something, you see how it works, and you fine-tune the next time. And then even if you think you've got it figured out, the exact plan and formula, like you said earlier, it ain't going to work every time. There's going to be situations where the diabetes gods are just out to smite you that day. It's something.
Yeah, just when you get brave enough to change your adjustments, and then that'll go beautifully for a week or two, and then suddenly it's like a car crash.
Yeah.
So,
physical activity can affect things. Even the activity you might have done 12 hours ago can still be having an effect. Hormone levels are affecting things.
Yeah, I feel like
we're
having
different
all
hormones
of that
in the body that affect glucose control. So it's too much to try to manage all at once. That's why we have this 70 to 180 range, or 4 to 10 millimole range that a lot of people work with. It's a broad range, but if you can stay in that range the majority of the time, that's more than good enough to keep yourself healthy long-term and feeling good today.
That's really good to hear. And I'm also really happy though, but you said also lifestyle has a lot to do with it. So anyone listening, I don't want you to like lay back and say, oh, okay, my blood sugar's good, and then never exercise again. That is not, if I understand correctly, that is not what Gary is saying. Eat healthy, exercise, take care of yourself, sleep well, do all of those things too. We're just
Never
focusing on the
believe it.
one subject. Excellent. So, okay, before we go, question for you. What's your favorite movie?
Casablanca.
Oh, okay. Good. Good one.
A
Yeah,
lot of
not diabetes
good
related.
one-liners from that. I like the old black and whites, Humphrey Bogart movies.
Oh,
Some Cary
nice.
Grant. There
Yeah.
was another movie, a Cary Grant movie called Arsenic and Old Lace that I really like.
Ah. Have you seen you probably have seen it, but have you seen the Human Trial yet?
Not yet, but it's
Oh.
on my watch list. I do want to see it. Have you seen it yet?
Not yet. We are maybe by the time this episode, or probably before this episode airs, we're partnering with someone to have it here. We're going to do a screening hopefully in the month of November, so we'll have some more, but I haven't watched it yet. And it looks really intense and emotional, and I kind of wish I would have watched it before, going to watch it again, but yeah, I'm super curious and excited to see it because
as a mom, you'll want to have lots of tissues handy.
I think so, right? That's the thing. As a mom, and I'm going there and, working with the cinema and one of the foundations here, and then all these other moms are going to be there. So I think I'll give everyone a complimentary box of tissues before we come into the theater, because who wouldn't love a cure?
I just got a shipment. I'm trying something for the first time. I ordered insulin from Canada.
Oh, you can do that in the US?
Yeah.
That's exciting.
I mean, the price difference is unbelievable.
I know. We were in Canada before COVID, and we went through the US. Aaron went to camp, and then I knew we'd be going to Vancouver, so I could time everything just right, where I had enough insulin that I brought with me from Dubai to get through the trip in US, not needing any doctors. Then we went up to Vancouver, then came back to the US. So when I was in Vancouver, I stocked up again, and I didn't know what to expect. I knew it would be over the counter, but it was amazingly affordable.
Mm-hmm.
But I did need to get a doctor's prescription in the end, because then we had a pump malfunction because we went whitewater rafting, and there was a crack in Aaron's pump, and we had no idea it was there because of the case. And he's in the front of the raft, and his pump's like going crazy. He's like, "Mom, it's really beeping." I'm like, "It's fine." And then when we stop, I'm like, "Oh my goodness, it's really beeping. Like something's wrong."
Yeah.
And
my only concern with this, shipping is the temperature. Is the temperature?
Yeah, for sure. So how do they do that?
I'm going to go examine the packaging and make sure I'm going to use the insulin. Make sure it's 100%.
Make sure it's okay. Someone was telling me about, one of the major carriers, that they do temperature control. Actually, it's one that's here, but not in US, because they were shipping some food or something, or a supplement. They were shipping supplements from UAE to Saudi, and they said they were actually doing temperature control. So if they requested it, I hope that it made it safely.
Yeah, well, I'll find out.
Interesting. Gary, thank you so much. I feel like this season I've taken so much of your time already. If you want to learn more from Gary or connect with his clinic, or buy his book, we'll put all of those links in the show notes so that you can know where to find him. He's definitely worth following, and definitely worth getting on his email list, because it's always educational. Almost everyone that works with Gary, or everyone, has type 1 or has been affected or touched by type 1 in some way. So they're super expert. And also they share their graphs when they go eat different meals, which I find really fascinating and a lot of fun. And it actually, you learn a lot too when you read about, everyone will go eat Chinese food, and then they share how that goes. And it's really great.
We did a pie challenge last week. I think those are going to be posted shortly.
Oh, that's exciting. A pie challenge. Okay. So you want to go sign up for that one for sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Gary. It's always great to talk to you. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye.